The selection committee revealed their current top 16 on Saturday, and surprise, surprise, the SEC has 5 of the top 6.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. We are your co-hosts for today's show. I am Andy Patton. He is Isaac Schade, and you are joining us at the place to get your college basketball content Monday through Saturdays. We're doing 6 shows a week, thanks to our good friend Leaf Tulane doing the Locked On College Basketball Game Night Show. If you haven't checked it out yet, you got to check it out. It's live every Saturday night after all of the action. Leaf hit on that Auburn-Bama game in a ton of detail on Saturday night. He also talked Purdue, Wisconsin, Michigan State, Illinois, handful of results in the Big 12, that UConn upset to Seton Hall. He got it all covered on game night. Check it out in your feed. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you all by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet is a win. Well, folks, Isaac and I were discussing the selection committee's top 16 reveal, which happened on Saturday, plus who won out of the 4 conference first place battles over the weekend, and whether those 4 winners will end up winning their conference at the end of the regular season, plus some bubbly results from the weekend, why an SEC team had the best weekend overall for their NCAA tournament hopes. We'll get to that to close out the show. Isaac, let's start with the Sweet 16, the top 16 reveal that we had on Saturday.
How wild would that be? What if this was the Sweet 16?
You know, it's never happened before. Maybe this will be the first time. This is the chalkiest NCAA tournament of all time. No, we had our 16 teams come out here. Personally, I didn't have any major issues, major surprises. There's one team on here that I think already is probably not in that conversation anymore. We'll get to that in a second. But Isaac, was there anything in here that kind of immediately stood out to you when it was revealed, or even now looking at it in terms of maybe something you don't think is actually going to end up happening a month from now?
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned it in the cold open that the SEC having 5 of the top 6, which was like, when you think about it, is not shocking, but just to hear it in this context was like, oh yeah. I mean, because we've just been riding with it and living with it all year. But to hear that from Bubba Cunningham, who was the selection chair committee, was just bonkers. But Andy, I think it was also a reminder of how different AP top 25 voting is versus selection committee voting, because I think they look at things the way we think about it in terms of full resume. And I say that because Chairman Cunningham said that they had unanimous selection of Auburn as the number 1 overall team, with due respect to Alabama. And he talked about, like, he was asked, hey, if we did this again tomorrow and Bama wins today, which they didn't, would you flip it? And I thought his answer was really insightful of how, look, basically this is just one data point in a season full of data points. Yes, it's a head-to-head, but Auburn's so far ahead, which now they're even further ahead, that probably not this one game would not turn the tide, because it's in Tuscaloosa. Turn the tide, not on purpose at all, because it's in Tuscaloosa, all that. So, Andy, I thought that was just really insightful for people who might not fully understand the scope of an entire resume.
Yeah, I thought so too. And, you look at this, you see those 5 of those top 6 teams to be Auburn, Bama, Florida are all on the one line, and then Tennessee and Texas A&M are the top 2 seeds, with Duke being the third 1 seed and the only non-SEC team in that group. But then you only have one other SEC team on this list. It's Kentucky, who took a loss after this came out, so maybe a little further down. They were the second 3 seed. So there's a little bit of a gap right there in the SEC. It's crazy that the gap between being a top 4 seed in the SEC is whether you're 5th, 6th, or 7th in the conference. That's just unheard of to be at that level. And then you see, a big chunk of Big 12 teams kind of filling in most of the rest of those gaps. You got Houston on the 2 line, Iowa State and Arizona are both on the 3 line, Texas Tech and Kansas currently are on the 4 line, Kansas being the team that probably not holding on to that spot anymore after that loss to Utah. And then from the Big Ten perspective, you got Purdue on the 2 line, Michigan on the 4 line. and sorry, Wisconsin, don't want to skip them. We were just talking about how Wisconsin's getting a little overlooked this year, so I apologize, Badgers fans.
Freudian, that was very Freudian.
They were on the 3 line, and then out of the Big East, St. John's on the 4 line there. But yeah, I thought it was nothing too surprising. Again, I think you're right that the fact that 5 of the top 6 teams were in the SEC is not a surprise, tells us everything we need to know about the strength of the SEC this season and how flat out dominant that conference has been. But you noted this in our show notes. 5 of those teams took losses this weekend. And now, granted, 3 of those 5 teams were playing other teams in the top 16. That would, of course, be Bama, who lost to Auburn, and then Purdue, who lost to Wisconsin, and then Arizona, who lost to Houston. And we'll talk more about 2 of those games a little bit later on. And then your other losses, I think, is where the conversation goes next, of Kansas losing at Utah. That's a really brutal loss for Bill Self's team. Kentucky at Texas, not as brutal of a loss because Kentucky was missing key players. Lamont Butler's been out, Jackson Robinson being out. Like, losing a road game to a good SEC team when you're not at full strength really doesn't hurt your resume the way that losing at Utah is going to hurt your resume, with no disrespect to the Use. They're just not on that same caliber of program.
And Texas would say, look, we didn't have Arthur Kaluma, so I don't want to hear your tears.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's a great point too. Texas was a little underhanded as well. So we had some superlatives that we listed out here. Isaac, we'll start with you on this one. Who do you think out of these 4? And okay, well, I say we'll start with you because my answer is Kansas, and I think that that's kind of the obvious answer of which of these teams is not going to end up being a top 4 seed next month when the Selection Sunday committee rolls around. I picked Kansas. It feels like the obvious pick after that loss to Utah. Did you go with anybody differently here?
Yeah, and I think this is a good moment to also say, Andy, to your point about some of these teams losing and falling out, those 5 teams that lost, is not an indictment of the selection committee. Sure. It just goes back to what we were saying about a full resume. Teams are going to take losses, people. That's just the nature of college basketball, especially when, as you said, Andy, they're playing each other. That said, I wanted to pick someone different than Kansas, just so we had multiple answers. And for me, it's Kentucky. Yeah. And the reason why is, their closing schedule is very, very difficult. They've still got to host Vandy, and let's remember how good Vandy is. They got to go to Alabama. They got to go to Oklahoma. They host Auburn. They got to go to Mizzou. And then really their only game that's like, yeah, you're definitely going to win is hosting LSU. So Kentucky, who, by the way, was without Jackson Robinson again, without Lamont Butler again, if they're not getting those guys back, I know they've got some new guys stepping up in Perry and Noah, and that's great. But if Kentucky falls apart a little bit, they could easily find themselves on the wrong side of this thing. So I'm going to go with Kentucky as my not likely to stay in.
Yeah, and with Kansas, I'll just kind of add on to it a little bit. They're kind of in a stretch where it looked like they had 4 relatively easy games and then 3 tough ones to close, and they already lost one of the quote unquote easy games on the road against Utah. Then they got a road game against BYU. That's not easy, especially with the way the Cougs are playing right now. Then they got Oklahoma State and Colorado. Hopefully you win both those 2 games, but then your finishers, you're home against Texas Tech, road against Houston, home again against Arizona. Like, that is as brutal as it gets to finish the season for Kansas. So they're in a position now where if they want to be a top 4 seed, you probably got to win 5, maybe 4 of those games. And they're just not playing like a team that seems all that likely that's going to happen for Bill Self and the Jayhawks. But Isaac, the next conversation, pretty obvious one, if we're talking about which team is going to fall of being a top 4 seed, who is not on this list do you think will end up or could end up being one of the top 16 seeds on Selection Sunday a month from now?
I'm tempted to say Michigan State, Andy, because of who they are, but their closing stretch is very tough. So if they navigate that, obviously they move in, but I don't know that they'll win all those games. So because of that, I'm actually going to go with Missouri. They are up to, as of Sunday, 15th in the net. They've got, on the other hand, a manageable closing stretch. They host Bama. That's tough, but it's at home. They got to go to Arkansas, host South Carolina, go to Vandy, to Oklahoma, and they host Kentucky. As SEC schedules that go, that's not the most awful thing. Right. If they keep playing like they've been, I mean, they are dismantling teams, Andy. It's really impressive. And so if they handle that well, give me the Tigers. What about you?
I'm going to go with Marquette, and I'm partly because of schedule. They're 23rd in the net right now, so they're a little bit farther back, just using that metric. But I think they're a team that they have 6 games remaining, and I see a good combination of winnable games as well as tough games that I do think they can win. And I think it's reasonable to project that they could go 6-0. They're home against Seton Hall, road against Villanova, home against Providence, road against Georgetown. You got to win all 4 of those. If you lose any of those games, you are no longer in consideration for a top 4 seed. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
You win those 4 games, then you're at UConn, and then you're home against St. John's. You got a little momentum if you win those 4 and you pick up that road win over UConn. Like, St. John's isn't going to be playing for as much at that point because they'll very likely have wrapped up the conference. Not that Pitino's going to, phone it in or anything, but I think you're in a real possibility where you go 6-0. And if you go 5-1, that might still be enough depending on what those teams around them in that conversation do. So give me Marquette potentially sliding into a 4 seed, another successful season for Shaka Smart regardless, but I think there's a chance that they could do that.
Andy, what about another superlative? Who is the most likely to end up a number 1 seed? Who isn't? It seems like all 4 of these number 1 seeds are pretty firm. But if Alex Kahn doesn't come back from Florida and they struggle, Alabama's closing stretch. I know they're number 2 overall right now, but they've got a gauntlet. What if they fall off? Who is most likely to move into one of those spots?
I think it has to be Houston. I think it has to be Houston for me. Obviously I know that the 2 other SEC teams are ahead of Houston, and Purdue was ahead of Houston, probably wouldn't be right now after the loss to Wisconsin. But for me, Houston, they have a great final stretch with the ability to pick up major wins. They got Iowa State, they got Texas Tech, they got Kansas, they got Baylor. Now, that's also an opportunity to pick up some losses and potentially put yourself in the position where you're a 3 seed instead of a 2 seed. But this team's just rolling right now. I think they are going to go 3-1, maybe 4-0 in this final stretch. And they're 13-1 in the conference. They're 2 games ahead of everybody else in the Big 12. If you win the Big 12 this year with Arizona playing the way that they have, yes, Kansas and Baylor are down a little bit. But if you win the Big 12 by 2+ games, I think you got to be a 1 seed. And I don't know who, again, it's still going to take Florida, losing a game they shouldn't lose. It's probably going to take Bama losing a game they shouldn't lose. Nobody's in control of getting into the 1 seed conversation right now. The 4 teams that are there are holding on to it unless they lose. But if somebody loses, I could see Houston with a strong enough schedule getting into that conversation.
And I think that's a great point. They all 4 of those teams definitely control their own destiny. So that's smart. My answers, if it's not Houston, funny enough, it's basically whoever wins the Big 12, right? Like, Duke is not going to fall apart in the ACC, and the SEC teams are going to keep winning. So if not Houston, I can legit see Iowa State or Texas Tech doing this. Tech's closing run is handleable at TCU versus West Virginia versus Houston, as you mentioned, at Kansas versus Colorado, and at Arizona State. That's very doable. I could see Tech only taking 1 more loss, finishing 25-6, 16-4. They're currently 7th in the net. They've got wins over both Houston and Arizona. If they go in and take care of the Big 12 tournament along with that, man, there you go. Iowa State, similarly, 8th in the net. They do have a tougher slate than Tech, but they own the head-to-head win over Tech. And what they've got left is Colorado at home, at Houston, at Oklahoma State, against Arizona, against BYU, and then at K-State. And I think where Iowa State's claim might be is all 4 of their Big 12 losses are without Milan Momcilovic, who is now back, and they look like they did before he went out. The only other loss they have outside of that is to the best team in the nation, Auburn, in a game they could have easily won in Maui. So if Iowa State, who, by the way, is your defending Big 12 champ, if they can do what they do, I could see it. But Andy, I think what we're spot on with is the most likely team to move up would be one of these 3 Big 12 schools, whoever can run the table. Yeah. All right, guys, first place up for grabs all over the place this weekend. Big East. I mean, good night. It was so fun, Andy. We had a couple Saturday, a couple Sunday. We're going to get to that. Who firmed up their position atop their conference and who fell off the pace a little bit. That coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you about FanDuel, when the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started. What up, Mac McClung? And there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you missed the opening tip-off or you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on that action. And if you're looking for an even bigger payout, you can combine all these together in the same game parlay. It's great because when you win with FanDuel, you get paid instantly. Andy, it's Monday, and that means we got big Monday action going on. Baylor, a 1.5-point favorite at home over Arizona. Interesting. Duke, meanwhile, 14.5 favorite over Virginia. Not surprising at all there. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to check it out today. Again, FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Andy, we had 4 different of the top 6 conferences in the nation with first place on the line in a game this weekend. That was the SEC with Bama and Auburn. That was Big 12 with Houston and Arizona earlier on Saturday. Man, great games all around there. And then the same thing on Sunday. We had the Big East lead up for grabs with St. John's hosting Creighton at MSG. And then right after that, or kind of staggered a little bit with it, was New Mexico hosting Utah State in the Pit. All 4 of these games, Andy, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that they all lived up to the billing. And I'll also nod to Michigan really quick, who had to go on the road on Sunday to Columbus. And had they lost to Ohio State, they would have been back in a tie for first with Michigan State, who won on Saturday, by the way. Shouts to Coach Izzo, who became the winningest coach in Big Ten history. Andy, obviously, we saw what happened with these games. Who won, who attained, their spot atop the conference standings. What are your takeaways from this slate of top of the heapery?
It's funny. I was just kind of forming this as you were talking there. It's obviously college basketball loves if they can get a setup like this where you have first place on the line, 4 weekend games. Like this is absolutely perfection. But I don't think there's any way that this could have been like exactly pre-planned, because thinking back to our projections and many other people's projections for who would be the first place teams in these conferences, for the most part, we're not looking at that list out of these 8 teams. I mean, I think, Big 12, obviously Kansas was the preseason number 1. Iowa State, I think most people would have said Kansas and Iowa State as opposed to Houston and Arizona. Now, both these teams were very much in that conversation. For SEC, this maybe people would have said Auburn, Bama for SEC. I think
definitely Bama.
Yeah, I think Tennessee would have been in the mix. I think, and still obviously in the mix is a phenomenal team. But I think that's one where Auburn, Bama might have been the projection there. Big East, UConn would have obviously been the projection there. Marquette would have been the other projection, maybe Creighton as well, who's in this. But St. John's was kind of projected to be 4th, 5th. Mountain West, New Mexico, Utah State. Utah State was having another coaching change. People just don't know what to do with Utah State. They turn their coaches over every 2 years. They're still competing for first place in this conference, but I'm sure San Diego State and maybe even Boise State would have been in the mix.
Yeah, I'm looking back. Boise State was first place in the preseason poll, followed by New Mexico.
Yeah,
Utah State was 6.
It's just crazy. You just got to start just putting them down as 1 or 2 every single year, because clearly they're just going to keep doing it. But yeah, I mean, that's the beauty of college basketball, though. There was all these projections, and some of them look pretty good. Some of them don't look as good. But at the end of the day, you had a weekend, 2 games on Saturday, 2 games on Sunday with first place on the line in 4 of the major conferences in college basketball. That is awesome. And like you said, the games delivered. All of them were close games. The biggest margin was the Auburn-Bama game, and that was a fantastic game through and through. Just a really fun group of games. And for anybody who didn't watch and has been eagerly waiting for us to tell you the winners, apologies. Houston beat Arizona. 62-58 was the final there. They're now 13-1 in the Big 12, 2-game lead with 6 to go. Auburn beat Alabama, 11-1 in the SEC, first place by 2 games with 6 games to go. St. John's beats Creighton, 79-73, the final there, 13-2 in the Big East, 2-game lead with 5 to go. And then New Mexico beating Utah State at the Pit. Barely. Utah State gave them everything they could.
Man, what a game.
Yeah, the Lobos pulled that one off. They're now 14-1 in the Mountain West, 2-game lead with 5 to go. So everybody's got a 2-game lead except Auburn, who's just got a 1-game lead over Bama. 5 or 6 games to go. Isaac, feels like we just saw a lot of teams maybe not cement first place in their conference, but they put themselves in a really nice position to do so with wins over the weekend.
Yeah, and I mean, it was so fun. Also, we mentioned Michigan. I just looked at the preseason Big Ten media poll. Michigan was 9th preseason. And,
crazy.
Crazy. Yeah, dude, I love that insight from you, man. That is so brilliant. Like all of these games were uber fun and really interesting. Like for Auburn to do that in Tuscaloosa, man, that was something wild. And so we look at this and we start wondering, all right, as you said, we've got like a quarter of the conference schedule left basically for most of these teams. And what we start to wonder then is, all right, who's going to hold on to it down the stretch? So Andy, out of these, let's include Michigan, out of these 5 teams that are currently in the lead. So that would be now Houston, Auburn, St. John's, New Mexico, and the Wolverines. Who to you is the most likely to finish the regular season as the outright champion of their league?
I'm going to go St. John's. I think that they have the combination of, first of all, they have 5 games left, whereas the SEC and the Big 12, most of those teams have 6 games left, so that helps. They have a 2-game lead. Again, that's the same as everybody except Auburn. But they also have a pretty favorable schedule remaining. They have a 2-game lead over Creighton, I should say. They have a 2.5-game lead over Marquette. The remaining 5 games for St. John's at DePaul, that's comfortable. Let's put it that way. Home game against UConn. At Butler, also fairly comfortable. Home game against Seton Hall. Don't want to denigrate Seton Hall after their win over UConn, but St. John's got them at home. I think you feel pretty good about that. And then at Marquette, and that's obviously going to be an incredibly challenging game. But for the most part, that's a pretty good schedule if you're St. John's. And you're feeling you got a huge win over Creighton. That was much needed for them at this point. 2-game lead, 5 to go. If I'm Rick Pitino on the Johnnies, I feel really good about my chances of winning the Big East regular season outright, which what an incredible accomplishment if they're able to do so for Pitino in his second year at the helm.
Andy, I know it's absurd to say this because it's historically one of the best perhaps is going to go down as the best conference ever. But I feel like until Auburn gives us a reason not to pick them, I got to go with them. I mean, I know they've only got a 1-game lead over Alabama, but as SEC schedules go, it's very doable. They 3 straight home games right now, Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi. Unless, if Auburn beats themselves, they lose one of those, but they win all 3 of those games. And then it's at Rupp, at Texas A&M, hosting Alabama.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, those 2 road games are going to be very difficult. Alabama's going to come into Auburn very, very irked about what happened on Saturday. But I don't see Auburn, barring Janai Broom's injuries resurfacing or something like that. That's the only thing I could see doing it. But I mean, they're just a juggernaut, man. And so until, as crazy as it sounds, I'm going to go with Auburn for my answer.
Yeah, I thought about Auburn because they are the best team in college basketball and they're playing like it. But the fact that one of their games left is against Bama makes it just so much trickier. And yes, Bama may not still be 1 game behind Auburn by the time that game rolls around. Bama's got a much trickier schedule going forward than Auburn does. But yeah, it's this Auburn team is so good that the fact that we feel like a 1-game lead for them feels fairly safe is incredible considering the conference that they play in. And Houston's been an absolute juggernaut as well, but they got a game at Texas Tech. That's the only team in the conference they've lost to. They're only up on them by 2 games. So it's that's tricky. They also got Kansas and at Baylor left for Houston. So that's tricky. New Mexico's next 2 games are at Boise State and at San Diego State. And they also got Nevada on the road as 3 of their 5 games remaining. That's really tough for New Mexico. So I think that they're in a comfortable spot right now, but it's a little bit less comfortable when you got 3 tough road games still on your schedule. So yeah, I like Auburn as the second team here besides St. John's, who I just think it has such a scheduling advantage. But yeah, it's wild that we're talking about the greatest conference ever and Auburn having a 1-game lead with a game against that team and still feeling confident in Bruce Pearl's club.
Man, it's awesome. I love it, Andy.
It was a very, very bubbly weekend in college basketball, and one SEC team had a fantastic weekend with a big-time win over a top 15 club. Well, Isaac, closing out our show here on Monday with it's a little bit of a 6-pack. It's an extra bubbly 6-pack as we're going to talk about some of the bubble results from the weekend, some teams that won, some teams that really hurt their bubble chances, what that looks like here with 1 month, pretty much exactly until Selection Sunday and the official start of March Madness. So we're using Joe Lunardi's Friday bracketology report. So obviously this is updated and changed a little bit, but we use that going into the weekend of, how many of these teams that are considered bubble teams by Lunardi won this weekend, how many lost this weekend. And for the 4 teams in the last 4 buys, the teams just hanging on by a thread to being in the big dance, only one of those 4 teams won over the weekend. So if you're a team on the bubble, you're feeling pretty good about that. For the last 4 in, 2 of those teams won, and 2 of them were in games that were double bubble games. So even though they won, another team on the bubble potentially lost. First 4 out, Only 3 of those teams played. VCU was off, but 2 of those 3 teams won. And then in the next 4 out, just 1 of those 4 teams won. So if you're a bubble team that got a win this weekend, you're feeling really good because a lot of other bubble teams did not. Whereas obviously, if you're one of those teams that took a loss, maybe it doesn't hurt as bad knowing that a lot of other teams in that conversation lost as well. But Isaac, we had a pretty clear pick, at least in my mind, of the team that had the best weekend in terms of boosting their NCAA tournament resume over the weekend. Who did you think that was?
Hook 'em, baby. The Texas Longhorns, yes. Which shouts to my wife, who's a massive Longhorns fan. So it made for a good weekend at Shady Acres, which is what we call our house. By the way, Andy, let me just go ahead and say real quick here as we're talking, over this final month of the regular season, almost daily, I will put out on my social media like a bubble watch cheering guide, meaning if you're a bubble team, who should you be cheering for today? Right now, it's basically other bubble teams to lose, but I'll highlight that, make sure you know. And then as we get to conference tournaments, I'll start including like potential bid thieves and stuff like that in conference tournaments. And so just a little plug there if you're wondering, like I feel like I get questions all the time now. Who should I cheer for? My team's on the bubble. Check out social media. It'll be there for you. But Andy, like this is a massive win for the Texas Longhorns. Kentucky comes to town. And as we've said earlier in the show, Kentucky's shorthanded, but so was Texas in this game. Andy, it was interesting because for a while in this game, I think if we looked at the chart of like win percentage, Kentucky would have had the better chances for the vast majority of it. But then Texas just like wrested control late in this thing and really kind of ran away with it not ran away with it, I should say. It was a 4-point game in the end. But the first half of the second half, or the third quarter, if you'll allow me that, was where I thought Texas really stepped up. And Trey Johnson, man, I just really thought he had a nice game here. Just doing what he does, right? Like played 36 minutes, 32 points for him. But I also don't want to miss Tremont Mark, who had 26, which if I remember correctly, I'm not looking it up, I can do it while you talk, I think was a career high for him. And so these two dudes combined, man, just really, really good day for them. Johnson was 9 of 10 at the line, just good stuff, and needed it at home. And Rodney Terry's team got it. Yeah,
Texas is definitely the winner here. Vanderbilt could have been. They could have been. They had an opportunity to beat Tennessee on the road.
And 16, Andy, in the second half.
Yeah, they had a huge lead. And to blow that big of a lead in any game, in any capacity, is brutal. To do it in a road game against a top 5 team in Tennessee is extra brutal. It didn't hurt their resume all that much. They went up in the net, which is not really surprising. They probably, I didn't check KenPom. I'd be shocked if they fell at KenPom. They probably rose at KenPom as well. It's just brutal to have had that kind of lead. A close loss to Tennessee does not hurt Vanderbilt's chances, but a win would have dramatically helped them. And now they have to go try to find another win against the top team. Fortunately, there's opportunities to do that in the SEC, but they're not easy to do. The other teams that I thought had really nice weekends for bubble purposes, San Diego State gets a comfortable win over Boise State, who is also on the bubble. They beat them by, I think, 17 points. That's a nice quality win for Brian Dutcher's club. And then BYU, 15-point win at home over Kansas State. A month ago, we wouldn't have talked about beating Kansas State as really meaning anything, but Kansas State has been red hot as of late. Themselves was in that bubble conversation. So for BYU, this is a big-time win. They got Arizona coming up next, another opportunity.
Kansas first.
They got Kansas first. You're right. Sorry. Yeah, really nice stretch here for BYU to potentially cement themselves as an NCAA tournament team if they can keep playing good basketball the way that they have as of late.
Andy, and you're right. I was looking at KenPom while you were talking. Last Saturday, Vandy was 50th before their win over Texas. And as we talk on late Sunday night, they were 41st. So have moved up. And they went into the Tennessee game 46th. So lost that game, moved up 5 spots. So that's a great call by you without even looking at the numbers. And that's what you got to do. And it's funny, I didn't think about it until we were talking, but Vandy was not the only bubble team in the past 4 or 5 days to squander a big second half lead. Wake did that the other night against Florida State, was up 16 in the second half and choked it away. Steve Forbes says, I think that was maybe the worst loss of my career. Very hurtful for both of those teams, because then Wake, and that brings me around to saying in one of our double bubble games this weekend, Wake loses to SMU. SMU solidifies themselves while Wake unfortunately falls further off the bubble. Andy Patton.
Yeah, I think you feel a little bit better about squandering a lead to a fifth-ranked team in the country than you do squandering a lead to Florida State the way that Wake Forest did. But yes, the sentiment, brutal to not win either of those games. A couple other bubble results. West Virginia had a really great opportunity to take down Baylor on the road, could not quite get it done. Baylor wins that one 74-71. West Virginia has now lost 6 of their last 8 games, not having Tucker DeVries. Really, really hurting this team. They got a pretty tough finisher. They got Texas Tech on the road. They got BYU and Utah on the road, as well as a couple others. We'll see if they can pull it out. Oklahoma, speaking of teams that were in the battle for Atlantis, Oklahoma, they lose to LSU, another bubble team going down. They're now 3-9 in the SEC. It's just hard to see a path. And I know that the SEC is so deep and that we're realistically talking about 10, 11, 12 teams from the conference getting in. But like 3-9 in your conference is just really hard to stomach. And for Oklahoma, they're at Florida. They got Mississippi State, Kentucky. They're at Ole Miss. They got Mizzou and Texas.
They might lose all of them.
They might lose all of those games. And if they do, they're nowhere close to it. But even if they win half of them, if they win half these games, it depends which ones, obviously. But you win half these games, you're 6-12 in the conference. That's still just feels very difficult for me to imagine. But and that's no disrespect to Oklahoma. They are a good basketball team, and this conference is loaded. But I just have a hard time seeing it in that situation for the Sooners.
Yeah, I mean, that if they win half of them, as you said, that doesn't even get them to 20 wins. And there's just something about that threshold, Andy.
Yeah.
And I know we're talking bubble teams here, and Baylor's kind of a little more comfortable, especially now. But I just did want to mention about them that VJ Edgecombe was back and played a whole bunch of minutes. So that's really important for Scott Drew's club here down the stretch. Andy, any other bubble noise to say before? I just want to ask a quick question about some of our upsets this weekend.
Yeah, my last bubble thing will be this. In the next 4-out category for Lenardi on Friday, Xavier was in that conversation. Xavier picks up a comfortable win over DePaul, which we totally like. They just had to not lose that game. They did not lose that game. They're 54th of the net, which is not great. They have 2 quad 2 losses, which is not great. But here's the deal. Xavier's final 5 games, Butler at home, Seton Hall on the road, Creighton at home, Butler on the road, Providence at home. Obviously, Creighton is a tough game, but it is at home for Sean Miller's team. I would not be surprised if Xavier goes 5-0 in this stretch of basketball. I would be surprised if they went anything worse than 4-1. If they go 5-0 in this stretch, I think you got to start realistically talking. They're 1-8 in quad 1 games. That's obviously a huge challenge. But if you beat Creighton, maybe you start to be in that conversation. Xavier's a team that I think is on the outs right now, but I'm keeping a close eye on them with that final schedule for them.
Yeah, Andy, I'm looking really quick. None of those final games are quad 1 opportunities.
Bummer.
Creighton is really close. They have them at home, and they're 32nd right now. But obviously, they lost on Sunday. So I think they lost on the road in a tight game. So they might move up. If they move up 2 spots, that becomes a quad. All that to say, just got to win those games. I think that's the important thing for them. All right, Andy, we had 3 losses this weekend, 3 upsets that were all kind of damning in some way. Obviously, UConn losing to Seton Hall was, Andy, hand up. I got to admit, when UConn went up by 5 in OT, I turned it when it was 68-63. I turned it to the whatever other big game was on at that moment. And then UConn didn't score again. Seton Hall wins. And the juxtaposition, and this is not me hating on Dan Hurley, just the juxtaposition of him walking off the floor the other night, waving goodbye, flashing his rings, to then this is kind of hilarious. Kansas losing at Utah. Leaf Tulane was in the building. Kansas just looked bad. They've literally flip-flopped win and loss for the last 8 games, Andy. They're at BYU as their next game. They could lose that one. And then Memphis on Sunday loses at Wichita State, also in overtime. They had a big opportunity at the end of regulation to win it, and they had one of those dumb, we don't drive and force a whistle and just float around and take a fadeaway 3 from the corner. What are we doing? But Andy, this is now 3 quad 3 losses for Memphis. It's just their second AAC loss, but still, that is not good for their resume. In your opinion, these are all damning. Yes. Which is the most?
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer because they're all in different spots. Like UConn lost a game that puts them fairly close to being on the bubble. I don't think they're on the bubble yet, But this loss is really problematic for them because like they keep losing to Seton Hall on the road, but like in the past, it hasn't hampered their resume all that much. But this Seton Hall team is worse than the previous couple of years of Seton Hall teams. This team is just flat out not very good. And for UConn, they don't have the wiggle room in their resume. So on one hand, I kind of think that's the one because UConn, like the team that did the most damage to their NCAA tournament resume in terms of still being in the field is pretty clearly UConn in my mind. Kansas is still going to be, they're still safely in the field. They probably hurt themselves in a seed line perspective, but Kansas has also put themselves in a position where they're not going to finish top 3 in the conference. And as we talked about, this will be back-to-back years where they haven't done that, first time since the early 80s. Does that matter as much as not making the tournament? No, probably not. I know Bill Self would tell you that, like they're comfortable that they're still going to be in the field at this point, but that's still a really ugly loss against a team that, you know, is fine in Utah, but is not even top 10 in this conference. And then Memphis, like another quad 3 loss, another, like, you know, we've seen these late season collapses from Memphis. I'm not saying that this is a collapse yet, but it's certainly worth keeping an eye on for Penny Hardaway and the Tigers. So Wichita State being the worst of these 3 teams, barely. Seton Hall's not very good, but I think that it's probably still worse for UConn in the grand scope of things, but they're all uniquely bad in their own ways.
Start Flory Badunga.
There you go.
Or as one of the commentators called him on Saturday night, Flory Badinga. That's very wrong. Okay. Andy, Big Monday slate tonight, both tip an hour later than typical. Duke number 3 as of this recording. Ooh, that's interesting. I wonder if Bama falls beneath them or not when and they were tied for 3rd with Florida. Ooh, I can't wait for the new poll. They're in Charlottesville tonight, 8 p.m. Eastern on ESPN. Duke, as we said earlier, by 14.5 at FanDuel. And then a big Big 12 game. Number 13, Arizona at Baylor, 10 p.m. Eastern on ESPN. Bears minus 1.5. Baylor could string together back-to-back wins. Arizona, they lose this one. It's back-to-back losses. Really intriguing game there in the Big 12. Folks, thank you so much for being with us. If you've not subscribed to the show yet, go ahead and do it. We're closing in on 4,000 YouTube subscribers. Crazy stuff there. Thank you for being part of this ride. We got a month till Selection Sunday. You don't want to miss a second. The way you do that is by subscribing, hitting that bell notification so you know every time we drop a new episode. We want to say, and also don't forget to subscribe to the Locked On College Basketball Discord. It's free. That link is in the show notes. Man, great conversations in there all the time. Want to say apologies to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wild Popes. Shouts to Mick Bruins. And until tomorrow show, peace.